All right, diving in. This one you sent in is a real head scratcher. We're talking analytic idealism.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently about, like, what reality even is.
Totally. And, looking at what you sent, it seems like you're grappling with some seriously big questions, like what's reality actually made of? How does what's going on in our heads connect to the physical world? Is consciousness just our brain doing its thing? Or is it something, I don't know, more than that?
Those are the exact kinds of questions analytic idealism tackles.
We're going deep on this one.
So what we'll try to do in this deep dive is to lay out the main ideas of analytic idealism based on what you shared. We want to make sense of the confusing parts, like how do regular objects fit into all of this? And then what does this perspective mean for understanding consciousness, the universe, even ourselves?
We're aiming for those aha moments, those insights that make you go, oh, I get it, but, without overwhelming you with jargon.
Exactly.
Okay, so the core idea here is that reality is fundamentally mental.
That's the heart of it, yeah.
And I bet you're thinking, mental? Like thoughts and feelings? How can that be the same stuff that makes up a rock, for instance?
That's the puzzle, right? The interview you sent mentions a stone on the beach. It's natural to wonder, if reality is mental, does that mean the stone itself is mental? Or does it only become mental when someone's looking at it?
Right, like does my mind make it mental?
Analytic idealism says everything is already mental. It's not about our observation making it so. Think about your brain.
Okay.
It's a physical object. You can study its parts. It's made of the same stuff as everything else. Carbon, hydrogen.
The basic building blocks.
Right. But this physical brain is how your inner mental life shows up to someone else. All your thoughts, feelings, memories.
Yeah.
To an outside observer, they're happening in your brain.
So inside my head, it's all mental states, but to you, it's connected to my physical brain.
Exactly. Now, analytic idealism says this applies to everything, not just brain. The interview points out that if it didn't, we'd have this weird split in nature where some things are mental and some aren't.
That would be messy.
So everything is fundamentally mental. What we perceive as matter is just what these mental states look like from the outside.
So a stone, even though it feels solid, is actually a mental state showing up as matter.
Okay, but how do we wrap our heads around that? The interview uses an analogy, the airplane dashboard. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Imagine an airplane. It's got sensors that measure stuff like airspeed, altitude, temperature. All that data shows up as readings on the dashboard instruments.
I get it.
Now, if the plane isn't flying, the dashboard is blank, but the air outside, the environment, it's all still there, right?
Of course. So how does this relate to our stone?
Well, think of matter, like the stone, as the dashboard readings. It only shows up when there's an airplane, an observer interacting with it. But the reality behind those readings, like the sky the plane flies through, that's always there, and it's mental.
So the stone in itself is a mental state that exists whether or not I'm looking at it? Right. When someone picks it up, that's like the airplane interacting with the sky, causing the dashboard readings that we perceive as the physical stone.
So observing something is like taking a measurement of this underlying mental reality, and that measurement is what we experience as matter.
Exactly. And the brain is like a dashboard for our thoughts and feelings, which is something we kind of already get intuitively. Analytic idealism just takes it a step further and says the whole physical world is like that.
Whoa. Okay, so this leads to another big idea, the mind at large. What is that exactly?
If all the matter we see is just the appearance of mental states, and there's this whole universe out there, stars, planets, and we don't think those are alive in the way we are,
right,
then analytic idealism says that all that stuff must also be the appearance of mental states, and those mental states belong to what's called the mind at large.
So when we look up at the stars, those aren't just chunks of matter, they're like expressions of this mind at large.
That's a good way to put it. The interview talks about how we all seem to experience the same world. Like, you and I can both see and describe this room in the same way. Analytic idealism explains this by saying, mind at large is the underlying reality we're all experiencing through our own individual dashboards.
Makes sense. So we're like individual points of awareness inside this bigger mind. The interview says our consciousnesses are like splinters or complexes of this mind at large.
Yeah, like little streams branching off from a huge river.
So then what about the purpose of life? Is there a grand plan, or are we just here randomly? The interview gets into this.
Right, and it leans towards a naturalist view. Analytic idealism, at its core, says that nature just does its thing. There's no big plan or external force controlling it. So it's possible there isn't a predetermined purpose in the way we usually think of it.
But the person being interviewed also shared a personal thought, something that struck them about the history of the universe.
Yeah, they noticed that life appeared pretty quickly after Earth cooled down, spread everywhere, and eventually we got humans who can think about thinking. So it's like the universe is, in a way, becoming aware of itself.
So So it's not that there's a preset purpose, but that nature might be driven towards self-awareness. And we, with our ability to think about these things, are a big step in that process.
And the interview even talks about the cost of evolution, all the suffering, as if nature went to a lot of trouble to get to this point of self-awareness.
Wow. Okay, so is all life conscious then? Even like bacteria?
That's what the interview suggests. Every living thing, no matter how simple, has its own consciousness. All those things that make something alive, like metabolism and growing, those are seen as signs of an inner experience, even if it's totally different from ours.
So if it's alive, it's conscious.
That's the idea. The interview draws a clear line between living and non-living things. Viruses, for example, they don't do those things on their own, so they probably aren't conscious. But anything that's alive, it's experiencing something.
So this changes the whole mind-body question, right? Instead of asking how brains make consciousness, analytic idealism says maybe it's the other way around. It is a huge shift. For a long time, the idea that mind was primary, that it created the physical world, was more common. The idea that the brain creates the mind is actually newer.
Interesting.
And a lot of neuroscientists today are careful about saying the brain creates the mind. They see the connection, the correlation, but they don't jump to conclusions about what causes what.
Makes sense.
Analytic idealism avoids this by saying the brain isn't making the mind, it's just what the mind looks like from the outside.
Like when we see brain activity on a scan, or when a drug changes how we feel, those are actually mental processes interacting, and we're seeing the physical effects.
Exactly. So then we have to ask, what is matter, really? Even physics is showing us that matter isn't just little solid balls like we used to think.
So if the old idea of matter isn't enough, what does analytic idealism say it is? It says that matter, consistently, is what mind looks like. All the different types of matter we see, from tiny particles to huge galaxies, and it's just all the different mental states and how they interact within the mind at large.
So our brains are what our minds look like, and the universe is what the mind at large looks like.
Yeah, it's like, imagine those old map makers trying to draw the world just by what they saw around them. They didn't get the whole picture. It's like they were looking at the dashboard, but not the whole sky.
Interesting analogy.
Scientists are doing amazing work figuring out how the pieces fit together, but maybe they're only seeing the dashboard without realizing the whole picture is mental.
So how does all this appearance stuff happen? If it's all mental, why do we see a separate physical world? The interview mentions dissociation.
Right. For something to appear, there has to be a separation between the observer and what's observed. Without that separation, there's no outside to see.
So, like looking in a mirror, the mirror creates the separation so you can see yourself.
Exactly. In psychology, dissociation is when parts of the mind get separated, creating different aspects of consciousness. Analytic idealism says this same process is happening everywhere, creating the whole physical world. Our consciousness is dissociated from mind at large, and our thoughts appear as brain activity because of that separation between our inner experience and an outside observer.
So there's separation between me and you, and between us and this table.
Exactly. It's like a nested system of separations creating the whole reality we experience.
What about evolution? Doesn't all that time contradict the idea of consciousness being fundamental?
Actually, analytic idealism sees evolution as the history of this dissociation process. All those changes over millions of years leading to complex creatures like us, that's just the dissociated parts of mind at large getting more and more intricate.
So it's not about matter somehow creating mind, it's mind separating and creating the appearance of different life forms.
Right. The interview even talks about random mutations and how there might be some bias in those mutations that we don't understand yet. But whatever the exact mechanisms are, natural selection is still the force that drives evolution.
Now, the interview also brings up limitations of perception, referencing Kant's idea of phenomena versus noumena. Phenomena is what we perceive, noumena is the reality underneath.
Right. Analytic idealism agrees that we mostly just see the world as it appears to us. We're limited to our own dashboard. But it has one big difference. We do have direct access to our own noumena through introspection, by looking inwards at our own thoughts and feelings.
But knowing the noumena of something else, like a star, that's a lot harder.
Exactly. We can try to imagine what it's like to be another person, but truly knowing the noumena of something completely different is a huge challenge.
Okay, so if it's all mental, can there still be objective reality?
The interview says yes, through perspectival objectivity.
What's that?
Think about your own thoughts. You experience them directly, so they're subjective to you. But from my point of view, your thoughts are objective. They exist whether I know about them or not. I can't just change them by wanting to.
So they're subjective to me, but objective to you.
Exactly. In the same way, mind at large is subjective in itself, but to us, it appears as an objective world. We all experience the same universe, even though that objectivity is coming from a shared shared subjectivity.
That's chippy. The interview also talks about the idea of God. How does mind at large relate to that concept?
The person interviewed, Bernard Carr, describes universal consciousness as everything that exists, mind at large, plus all the individual minds. Now, the Western idea of God often has two sides: omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence.
The all-powerful, all-knowing idea.
Right, and then the idea of a personal God, a being with intentions and a will.
So, does analytic idealism fit with those ideas?
It seems to fit with the first set: omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence. If universal consciousness is the foundation of everything, then it's everywhere. It knows everything in a fundamental sense, and it's the source of all that is.
But what about the personal God idea?
Analytic idealism, at least in this interview, doesn't really support that. They lean towards the idea that the mind at large is more spontaneous, not sitting there planning everything out. Those higher level mental functions like deliberate planning, those seem to come later, through evolution, not from the very beginning of universal consciousness. So you could believe in a personal God and still hold these ideas, but it's not a direct implication of the framework.
Then there's the difference between pantheism and panentheism, which often come up in these conversations.
Right. Pantheism says the universe is God. Panentheism says God is in the universe, but also beyond it.
So where does analytic idealism fit in?
It doesn't take a specific religious stance, but it leans more towards panentheism. The idea that our senses are for survival, not for seeing the whole picture, suggests there's more to reality than we can perceive. Like a bacteria with a simple sense of smell doesn't understand its whole environment. We might be in the same boat.
So there's likely more to reality than we can grasp. The interview also touches on consciousness itself. What are we even talking about when we say that word?
In philosophy, there's a lot of debate about this. This interview focuses on phenomenal consciousness, which is just the capacity to experience something, to feel what it's like to exist. You don't need fancy thinking or language for that. It's the most basic level of awareness.
And they talk about consciousness with a capital C and consciousness with a lowercase c.
Right. The idea is that there's only one big consciousness, the universal field. Our individual consciousnesses are like patterns within that field, temporary and separated, making it seem like we're all separate beings, like characters in a dream.
So if there were aliens on another planet, they'd still be part of the same universal consciousness.
That's the idea. The limits we experience, like not being able to read each other's minds, are because of the separations, the dissociation. It's not that we're fundamentally different consciousnesses, and this even ties into the idea that space and time might not be fundamental, but just ways our minds organize experience within this unified consciousness.
So what we think of as separate and distant might not be that way at the deepest level.
Exactly. The nature of space and time as maybe emerging from a mental reality is a big implication of this view.
The interview also briefly mentions those unexplained things, like ghosts or UFOs.
Yeah, and while analytic idealism doesn't say those things are definitely real, it opens up possibilities that a purely materialist view doesn't. If those separations between minds aren't absolute, maybe there can be some leakage or interaction, especially in weird situations. Doesn't mean those things are happening for sure, but it's not impossible within this frame.
Makes sense. And what about free will? The interview mentions a comment about its importance for love, justice, and morality.
It comes down to how we define free will. If it's about the feeling of choosing, that inner drive to act, then analytic idealism is compatible with that. Our minds are constantly changing, leading to actions.
But if it's about having truly free choice, could I have done something different in the exact same situation?
That's where it gets trickier. The interview argues that our choices are shaped by who we are at that moment, our past, our situation, our tendencies. So even though we choose and feel agency, we probably couldn't have chosen differently given all those factors.
But that doesn't mean our choices are meaningless, right?
Right. The universe is so complex that even without libertarian free will, the outcomes of our choices aren't predetermined. We learn and grow through experience, and our choices still shape what happens.
Okay. Then there's artificial intelligence. The interview touches on that too.
Yeah, they're skeptical about AI being conscious, at least the kind we have now with computers and algorithms. Consciousness, as we see it in life, seems tied to biology, to metabolism. Computers more like a complex tool, not a truly experiencing being.
But what if AI becomes more like us?
Maybe then things change. But for now, there's no strong reason to think current AI is conscious in the same way we are.
Okay, so what if analytic idealism becomes widely accepted? How might that change things?
It could change how we do science, maybe leading to research on things like telepathy or the placebo effect, which are often dismissed now. And the idea of a shared consciousness could change how we treat each other, leading to more empathy. We might worry less about finding meaning in life because existence itself becomes inherently meaningful. But it could also change how we think about death, since it might not be the end of consciousness.
That's a lot to consider. It gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. What is reality and where do we fit in?
Definitely. This whole dashboard analogy, the idea of dissociation and rethinking how mind and matter relate. It gives us new ways to look at these big questions.
So as you process all this, here's a thought. If our minds are like expressions of a larger consciousness, what would it be like to fully merge back with that? And how do our choices now affect that eventual merging? We haven't fully explored that here, but it's something to ponder as you continue thinking about all of this. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.